Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. The reason for this talk is that I have two colleagues who worked in a bigger project and where they used something called Styletron, which is a library for CSS and JS. But before we get to that point, I want to just talk about the general problems that we can encounter when we work with CSS at a scale. And at a scale, when I say this, I mean when there are several developers working in the same code base. So this can be broken down into several bigger problems. The first one is we're working in a global namespace. We're using globals. And if you're used to working with JavaScript, usually you're told this is a bad idea. You shouldn't be using globals at all. And just to illustrate, I will go to perhaps the right one. Here we go. Now you have to imagine this file being much, much bigger and having several CSS files that you work in that handles the styles in your application. All of the classes and IDs defined here are global, so they're susceptible to change. If I change something or add something and someone comes in 6 months later and adds something similar, something that has maybe the same class name, that will override the styles that I added. This ties into one of the other problems that we might face, which is isolation. So no matter how well we try to isolate our styles, and there are several methodologies and conventions you can use to do this, we're always at the risk of someone else overriding our styles. Now there's OOCSS by Nicole Sullivan and BEM by Yandex, which are naming conventions that you can use to kind of enforce a local scope in your CSS styles. But this is a convention, so it's not enforced in any way. It is something that you agree upon and that you try to follow. But one of the problems that you can face is if you define, let's say, a very general class name. I'm useless at naming things, so please excuse this poor example. If you, for instance, create a user button class, and then sometime later in the code or further along in the project you're working in, someone else defines something that has this same name, they will override your styles. And this is because your styles are not isolated. We can change them, we can override them. This can happen if we try to use the same class in two different places, because for us, naming this class to, let's say, user button makes sense. And if we use it in two places, we will override the style since it's the same class name. And this is not the intention that we have, but it's possible to do this. Another thing that's really hard to spot is dependencies. If I look at, for instance, this style sheet, what elements am I targeting? What styles? How is this element rendered? How will it look? Just by looking at this, I can't see which HTML elements I am targeting. I would have to go into my HTML file, into my markup, and look, because I can't, just by looking at this, see what elements I am targeting. And vice versa, if I am looking at my markup, just by looking at this section class doesn't really tell me what kind of style is applied to this element. Same thing here, I would have to go into my CSS file and I would have to look. I would have to do a search for this specific class name to see what styles are applied. So this is the same thing, really. This is, if I just look at this main content, it doesn't really tell me which CSS style is applied. Another thing that is really hard is being able to say, what can we delete in our CSS, for instance? What happens if I delete something that I feel is unused? If I'm looking at just this panel, for instance, I delete this from my markup, and this panel class is defined in my CSS. What happens if I delete it? For me, it may be unused in this particular page that I am working in, but it might be used by some other element in another part of the application. So deleting this would wreck the style somewhere else. And not being able to say exactly what happens if I delete this line of code is generally not a good thing. One thing that is hard also is to share constants. And with this, I mean, if you have CSS classes that you want to reuse somehow, it's kind of tricky. It's something we can do with JavaScript quite easily. We can share things across components, but it's something that is pretty hard when it comes to just CSS. Another thing that might be a problem is non-deterministic resolution. And with this, I mean, if you have two classes that are applied to an element and you're loading your CSS synchronously, this means we don't know when it will be loaded or in which order it will be applied. We can't say for certain that if we have two classes that is applied to a button, in this case, will it be red or will it be green? So this makes us unsure of how our UI will respond. We don't have a predictable UI behavior. And due to how specificity in CSS works, the latter rule will be applied also. So in this example, the bottom one will be applied if that one is loaded. If they are loaded in a different order, we can't say which class this button will get. And one way to solve this, and this is what people usually will do, is they will increase the specificity of the rule. So this is a button, it's located within a section, and so we will add something called a child selector and say that all of the buttons that are inside of this section should get this class. But if that doesn't work, we have to be even more specific, and there's no way to say where this will end. You have to be very, very specific to target some elements. And what is CSS in JS, for those of you who haven't heard this term before? And one thing I want to just say right away is I don't mean inline styles. This is how React started. And for those of you who are not familiar with React, it's a way of creating components using JavaScript. So it's a library which we can use for component-based design. So I would just like to show you an example of what I mean. We have a bare bones app here. This is a React example. So here we're using React to create a wrapper component and a button component. And the button component is located within our wrapper component. And here we're using just regular CSS to style this. And Radian is a library for CSS and JS that actually uses inline styles. And so it will look something like this, where we add the style on the element. Now this is something that we know it doesn't scale. If you work with CSS, you know that inline styles are generally a bad idea because we have to change it in a lot of different places We can't use pseudo selectors, for instance, or pseudo classes. So for this one, I will show you how it looks. Here we go, the Radium one. And we can see that on this element, we are adding a style attribute. So this is Inline Styles, and Radium is one of the most used CSS and JS libraries. But this doesn't help us because we can't add pseudo selectors. We can't use media queries, for instance. So what it really means to use CSS and JS is that you're using JavaScript to write your CSS. So you're co-locating styles that you are creating with your component. This means that if we're going to go back to the problems that we spoke about in the beginning, one of them was we're working in a global namespace. It's susceptible to change. People can come in and change things. You have developers coming and going, adding classes that might clash with classes that you have created yourself. So this goes away since the style is co-located within your component. We don't have this name collision. And also, something that we don't have to do anymore, we don't have to spend time on naming classes. This is something that is really hard for us humans to do, to name things in a good way. Another thing that this is really good for is that we can easily locate dependencies. What we saw before was it's hard to say what kind of style this element will get, and also this how they are related. I mean, how the dependencies are between our styles and our markup. With these libraries, we get a really nice way. I'm going to show you an example here. This is a React app again. So what we do is we see what kind of styles are imported due to our import statements up here. So we see exactly what styles are used in this component and what the dependencies are. And also, we're not pulling a lot of dead code. I mean, CSS that are not of concern for the component is never rendered. It's never sent to the browser. Because what we're doing is we're pulling in the CSS that is of concern for this specific component. And also we can share constants. Because one thing you can do is you can either in your component, you can specify the styles directly here and say what kind of style this element will have that will be rendered. But you can also pull in styles from an object. So here we have a styles object that we are pulling in to our component. So this can be reused for several different components later on. So instead of just specifying it here, we pull it in. And it's also possible to share these across components, even across projects, if you like. When it comes to this non-deterministic resolution, where we're not sure what will be rendered, since we're only loading a style that is of concern for the component, this is not a problem anymore. We don't have this race between different classes that will be rendered. And also, when it comes to isolation, CSS that is global is not isolated. But if we're using the CSS in our component, it's isolated within our component, and thus is not a problem if we're changing the style, it won't clash with anything else. Now, there are different libraries for using CSS and JS, and these can be divided into two categories. The first one is usage of template strings, and the other one uses objects. If you're not familiar with a template string is, it is a feature of ECMAScript 6, so it's a JavaScript version. And these allow us to use strings spanning over multiple lines, for instance, instead of concatenating them. So we can add new lines easily if we're using this, instead of adding a new line and then we're concatenating things. It also gives us an ability to inline code within the string. So we can dynamically change how this string will be outputted. A tagged template string is something that one of the libraries I will show you uses. And what it basically is, it's a function that takes a template string that we just saw as an argument. And this function needs to be defined before it is being used. And the first library I will show you, they expose such a function that takes a template string. So I have chosen between 3 different libraries, and these are just the most popular ones. It doesn't mean that they're best or that they have some kind of advantage towards each other. It's just they are very popular, and so I wanted to explore them further. The first one is called Styled Components. It uses the template strings that we saw before. What the template string notation does, it gives you the ability to use common CSS syntax. And when you're writing CSS, generally what you will do is you will write a property and then you will separate it using hyphen. Style Components also offers theming support. They support server-side rendering. So for the components that you are defining, you can actually extract your styles into a separate style sheet, and you can load this before. You can inject it so that the styles are loaded with the page. We don't get this flashed of unstyled text, for instance. So this is an example of how we can define a component using style components. So what we're doing here is we're creating a button. So this is a function that is exposed by styled. This is all you need to render a button, because it will render a button element targeted by these styles. And then we are rendering it on the page in the DOM. And I will show you an example of how this can look. Our style components is further down. So all of these examples, nearly all of them, are using React. And React is component based. So what we're doing is we are importing styled. So we're importing the styled objects, the styled object from style components. We define some kind of wrapper element, which we say is a section. So we will get a section element. We will get styles associated with this element. Then we define a button with these style rules, and then we inject them. So now we're rendering them in the DOM. So this button will look something like this. This is style component. Nothing's burning. It's just the alarm. So this is a very nice button that has a hover state. And what happens here is style components, they will generate a CSS class with style rules associated with it. You don't have to name them because this is taken care of by the library. So I really hope you can see down here, for instance, if it's big enough. Yes, this is a unique class name generated. It won't clash with anything else because all of the class names that it generates are unique. You could maybe do this yourself. I mean, you could generate a unique ID for each class and you could add this in your style sheet, but that's a lot of work. That's a lot of overhead just to make things unique. So style components offer us this. We don't have to think about naming anymore. For me, this is a big win. I'm really, really bad at naming things. You can ask my coworkers. And let's just go back to our slides here. And then this is like a very simple example of how we can achieve the same kind of styling. And this is kind of what we did before. We would have things separated. We have separation of concerns, we have our CSS, HTML, and JavaScript in different files. But now we have everything collected in one file. So everything that is of concern for this component, I can easily see by just looking in this file. For me, this is very nice because I have a very lazy brain and having to look through different files or naming things. Just not having to name things is a big win for me personally. And also, vendor prefixes, they are automatically added. So this is not something you have to think about either. I know that there are solutions for this in Sass, for instance, where you can loop over and you can add vendor prefixes, but you can do this with JavaScript also if the library does not supply it. It is something that is taken care of. Aphrodite is the next library. It was made by Khan Academy, and they use objects instead of template strings. They support server-side rendering, and this is how they use. This is how we can render a component using it. So they expose a style sheet function with a create function on it. And what you do is you supply it with an object. And here you can see that there's a difference in how we write things. In the first one, let's just go back. We're still using like proper CSS syntax. But here, we're using something called camel case. Now that's the only difference. It still supports pseudo selectors and pseudo elements, server-side rendering and animations, media queries. And this is the old way we would do it. And now we have everything collected in one component. And I have an Aphrodite example here. They all look the same. It's the same button, just so you know. So what we do is we import the style sheet and CSS, this is a function from Aphrodite. So there's a bit of a difference in how they add the classes on the elements. So Aphrodite uses a CSS function, and then you supply the styles that you want to add. With style components, which is down here, you don't have to do this. You don't have to add the class on the element since you're rendering an element that already has this class on it. So there's a bit of a difference in how they solve this. And this was the Aphrodite one. Now, I like both of these. I have to say I'm kind of leaning towards the style components library because it's just easier. It's a lot less code. There's nothing wrong with using Aphrodite. Another advantage of Aphrodite that I really want to mention, it's framework agnostic. Style Components was made with React in mind. It has React Native support. A lot of these libraries also have that kind of support, but with Aphrodite, you don't have to use React. You can use Angular if you want, or web components maybe. So it doesn't matter what framework you're using. Yes.
I'm not that good at CSS, but
Hmm?
wasn't the syntax in the style thing less syntax and not CSS syntax? I was thinking about the and.
Ooh, let me see. Do you mean in the Aphrodite example
No,
for
the
hat?
other one.
The other one, the style components. Let's go back to that one, which is here
Yeah.
and here.
And hover.
Yes,
Less syntax.
you can use less syntax too, but this is something you can, it's not,
Less
yeah,
CSS syntax. Okay, but it's not
yeah.
CSS at least. That's what I'm trying to say.
No, it's like more built out CSS syntax to make it more powerful, to make it easier for you to add styles also. Thank you. That was a really good question. Thank you. Oh, yes. Yes. Let's go back to this is the one. Oh, you can do that also. Um, Here, what you can do with Aphrodite, for example, let's just go here. You can conditionally render things if you want to using props. And also, with style components, since you're supplying a template string, you can also supply props and you can render if it's a primary color, let's say. Depending on the props, you can render different colors, just as a very simple example. Mm. Mm. If I'm sorry. Yes. So, oh, you mean in this one? Let's see. I think you would have to do it in when you're rendering your component. You would have to do it instead. So not here specifically. Yeah. And let's just go back. Yes.
I was just wondering, so you make a button, a component.
Mm-hmm.
If you have very similar components,
Yes.
what is the best way to deal with that?
Do you mean if you have like similar button components, perhaps, or
Like
yeah?
if I would, how I would used to do it is just to like add a selector for that specific wrapper,
Mm-hmm.
and that would make the button slightly different. But
Yes.
if I would make a component, I would try to reuse it as much as possible. But
Yes.
just with small variations, what is the best way to do that?
You could either conditionally render a style depending on where the button is located, perhaps, or what kind of user interaction is done with the button.
And you build
Yeah.
that into the component.
You would build it. You would in your style declaration. Let's see. It's easier if we go here, maybe. Here you could actually render conditionally things. So if you have, it's the same example again, but if you have like a primary color that you want to add for a button in a multitude of places, but in a specific place, no, I want this to be different, you can specify your condition here, and then it will have a different style, but it's the same component you're using. You're just using a different style when you're rendering it. It's a good question. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, you can for Aphrodite, you can define it here. So that's possible. What you can do is you can either supply green or red, for instance. This is an object, so we can conditionally render things in here. No, not here, but up in the where we render it, we have access to props. And so it will be rendered along with the component.
Okay, so can you maybe write or show an example of how you like I don't get like how you get the scope of props.
Would it be okay if we did this during the Q&A just to, because we're running out of time, just, yeah. No, that's okay. It's a good question, yes. Oh, last one is Glamorous. This is the last library I'm going to show you. This library also uses objects. They support server-side rendering. They have theming support. This library is based on style components and another library called Glamour. So if you're going to use this, you need to install Glamour also because it has a dependency on that. And they use objects. So we use this syntax called camel case for our properties. And I have an example of Glamorous as well, just so I can show you the code. Here we go. So we import Glamorous. We tell it to create a section, a wrapper, what kind of styles that we wanted to have associated with it. And then we render them down here in our render function. Now this is when it comes to Glamorous and Aphrodite, I really want to show this. We have the same advantage of generated class names. So with Aphrodite, they will be put in a script, in a style element in the head of the page. But also down here, you can find all of your different classes, and I'm going to try to dig in here. So they will prefix them with the name. So we've defined a wrapper component and a button component, and then they will generate a unique ID for this element, for this component. Glamorous works in the same way. They will also inject a style element where they will add the classes that you defined. And then they will also generate a unique name for each class. Oh, here we go. And as always, this is the old way we used to do things. And before we get to this slide, I just want to show you there are other solutions that I'm not showing today. This is called Glitz. This is another library you can use. So what you do is you tell it to create a div or a headline, level 2 and H2 for instance, and what kind of styles you want to apply to it. And here we're pulling styles in from somewhere else. We can reuse these and put these on different components. And here, that's the end of my talk. I would like to thank you all for listening to me. And this was my first talk at Foo Café, so this is actually a milestone for me, standing in front of a bunch of strangers and talking about things. Yes.